Hello. Thank you for inviting me to be part of the Alternative Education SIG this morning. My name is Jo Trowsdale and I'm based at the University of Warwick. My presentation this morning is part of a wider research into a particular case study which argues for art making being considered as a site for education. I use a particular case study of the Imaginarium and argue that art making is an inherently educative experience, one that we should revisit. It's not a new argument. John Dewey developed this in 1934, and it's one that has been taken up and developed and reiterated by a number of arts educationists such as Eisner and more recently by Tim Ingold, which are strands that I discuss more broadly in the study. But for today, I'm taking a particular lens, drawing on Lejuvenating's concepts of community of practice, and particularly the notion of legitimate peripheral participation as a means of knowing in that context. So the notion of community of practice that Lejuvenating suggests, I'm applying to this art-making community of the Imagineers in the Imaginarium case study, and particularly helped by their notion as social constructionists of sociality being at the core of the way in which learning happens in a community of practice. In fact, they argue that children particularly operate in just that way, that there are a range of communities and the adult social world is such a community of practice. And they argue that children are quintessentially legitimate peripheral participants in adult social worlds, that they learn often unwittingly and unnoticed by adults in adult social worlds about how to behave, and they absorb information and ways of behaving and skills, and that this is at the heart of the way in which education naturally happens and could be maximized. So their work suggests that all participation is inherently educative. And in that notion of being educative, they draw on, and I particularly am attracted to the notion of educative experience that Dewey suggests in his 1938 text as being experiences which stem from an individual's existing cultural context and develop and extend further. So in that notion, by being part of a community of practice, one is absorbing and learning constantly, and children are in this position in society and constantly well practiced. Another factor that Lejuvenating suggests is that the level of participation that a child takes, that any member takes in a community, is defined by them, and that all such positions are not only legitimate, but they're also valuable to the process of education. They enable us to reflect on the fact that naturally when we're learning something new, we may stand peripherally, we may observe and be at a distance, but that as we get further into the experience, if it engages us, we will bring ourselves in ways that make us feel confident or that make us curious. In other words, we will decide where and how we want to invest. But that process of moving forward, engaging more deeply, is a natural part of learning, and the notion that might be that further engagement is a sign of deeper education, they suggest is inaccurate, and they contest that dominant view of standing away being a means of not learning so much and engaging more being a means of learning more. So it's a slightly different conception of participation that they suggest. And it's also informed by the kind of emphasis upon horizontal structures, on learning from each other, that children, for example, learn from each other, that members of any community of practice learn from each other more than they learn in other ways. That's not to say that there aren't moments when a hierarchical power structure operates. And they also suggest that the dynamic between the power structures of any community and these horizontal structures are areas of debate and for development. But nonetheless, what they do emphasize is the significance of these horizontal peer learning, which education more broadly uses, but particularly get activated in the community of practice sort of structures. And then finally, but most centrally, the notion that a community practice in the education here is based on practice. So it's through practice that they learn. In fact, Tim Ingold and Jean Lave talk about learning as being understanding in practice, an understanding in practice which integrates the mind and the body and the effect. So with this notion of community of practice in hand, then, I want to just identify the particular emphasis that this case study has drawn me towards, which is there are many communities of practice. There are also many of art-making community of practices, but this particular case study I'm looking at is one which emphasises the educative experience and emphasises embodiment in its character. So to continue with that then. Participation in this community of practicing Imagineers, as I witnessed, emphasised the embodied action as being intelligent. Tim Ingold talks about the idea that typically in education, movement is used as a way of knowing. So you do something in order to know, in order to understand. And he contests that, as does Margaret Wilson from a scientific perspective, suggesting that movement is knowing, that actually the sensing that happens in one's body is actually intelligence. Margaret Wilson argues that actually that's how we've evolved as human beings, is that our bodies tell our brains. It is not the brains that is interpreting, it is the body that is sensing. So this emphasis upon embodied action is an interesting dimension in relation to art making. And it's also one that naturally, as one can see, values the affective, because if one senses and feels something physically in the body, that obviously connects the way one's emotions with learning, and it recognises the interrelationship that's there. Participation in this community of practicing Imagineers also affirms children as creative and generative. They see themselves, they witness themselves, they feel themselves being idea generators. They see themselves making things. They have the satisfaction of witnessing themselves. But the process is exploratory, and they're making lots of small decisions, making judgments as they go through. And that fosters an interpretative, critical way of thinking, which allies with the creative. And it means that they are learning, they are being taught and developing knowledge as is needed to the task in hand. So they're developing skills, knowledge and understanding as they move forward. And in the context of an art making community of practice, this particular one, learning is always culturally situated. In this one, children were learning in Coventry about some of the myths and social values that are important to their city, and thus they could relate to those stories, to those ideas as both universally and personally significant. So all of these factors were at play. I'd like now to just talk a little bit more precisely about the case study, which was led by a cultural organisation called Imagineer, who had been working for some time with engineers and designers in developing large-scale outdoor events. And this particular cultural event, which involved constructing a mechanical giant version of Godiva, who represents a number of positive social values for the city, reawakening her for the 21st century, involved engagement differently with more complex tasks, which had to be both aesthetic and efficacious in scientific terms. So there was this natural melding of arts and science, which formed a community of practicing Imagineers, and who reflected on how they had been learning and how significant this might be in order to develop a project for young people. And that's how the project of the Imaginarium was initiated, was first thought of. In this process, children came in as young apprentice Imagineers to an existing community to work as they typically did on a real commission, a commission that had been set to Imagineer and to which children were joining that community. And in that process, they worked in highly embodied ways. So they explored the social ideas through role play. In the top left-hand corner, you can see children who are exploring ideas of power and inequality in the city. And they are embodying that. They are feeling that through their bodies. And then you also see them exploring the way in which forces and weight and stability are created through wide-based triangular shapes, and the way in which pivot points matter in terms of creating stability and the tension of materials. So feeling that through the body and being able to then apply that in the way in which they constructed their own designs. In their process of working, they were regularly set problems, and so they were problem solving in the moment. They were discovering that failure was a means of learning, so something not working was a way of finding something out. In the right-hand image here, you can see the Rube Goldberg type activity that they were engaged in. And in the left-hand side, you can see the ways in which they worked in these groups around workbenches, where they were standing free-bodied, able to draw upon materials that were around them, but they're engaged with each other, and the adults are on the periphery. So the adults were seen really as provocateurs, ones who could bring in particular kinds of skills or guidance, or who might be able to introduce a material or a technique, but that the actual creative process, the making process, was led and owned by the young people. So that's not to say they didn't have moments of traditional master-pupil learning. You can see in the top left-hand corner one Imagineer working with a girl and teaching her a particular skill, and children often reflected that, adopting and echoing both the safety and the practical techniques, as the boy in the left-hand corner is. But predominantly in the image on the right, where two children are trying out an idea together, seeing how something might work and how it looks, and the adult is in the background simply observing whilst they discuss that and try out ideas, was more common to this. So this is a practice-based way of learning, where there's a kind of hybridity between the skills and knowledge being acquired and taught and observed, absorbed as needed. So in this art-making community of practicing Imagineers, it was the Real World Commission that was shaping the educative experience of the community of practice, its curriculum and its pedagogy. And as members of this community, so not imaginative, but as genuine members of this community, children were legitimately given the agency and the freedom to try ideas out practically with materials, to adapt things, to make judgments. This was their learning. They were developing knowledge and skills and behaviours as needed for the task in hand, following the guidance of the Imagineers. And they discovered or constructed personal significances to the work as it developed. Sometimes they saw that immediately. They saw a relationship between something that mattered to them or related to somebody in their family. But sometimes that emerged as the project developed. But they were all often different. One child might find that actually thinking through something mathematical gave them confidence that made them feel better about their maths work. Another child might talk about the fact that working as a team enabled them to feel that they could work in their football better. So there were a whole range of different contexts, but this personal significance that the work gave them, whether it related to learning something that one might recognise as a school curriculum or something that might be more significant to their wider life, was common across all 4 years of the study. And they worked collaboratively. The other thing that was very significant was that the relationships with the Imagineers and with each other were mattered and were recognised as mattering. So, to conclude then, what implications does that have for us? It's a single case study. It's only one example of way of working, but it does suggest a number of things. Firstly, it suggests that the ways in which children were enabled to participate or chose to participate enabled a broad education. So both qualitative and quantitative study suggests that children were learning about art, science, maths, design and technology, and they improved in that learning, which both teachers and children affirmed, but also that they felt they learnt more broadly about themselves and became more confident in their capability and their potential. The study also highlights the importance of the embodied as being an educative mode, and that the embodied is connected with the affective and it matters in learning. It also emphasises the significance of sociality and the autonomy and agency that comes with that kind of sociality in engaging learners. The Imaginarium also offered a model where knowledge is hybridized and developed around real world tasks, so that we're looking at using arts and science lenses, for example, on that making process simultaneously, and they are interweaving and informing. So all of these things are significant, and many of these will be common to alternative educators as being natural to learning. I think what's significant about this is that it's a project that was conducted with schools, and that the legacy of it is that the schools are wanting to work on developing that skill in their staff. And so its significance is that it proposes a model and structures that seem to be possible within mainstream schooling, and which teachers are now asking us to work with them and to develop further. And that's the next stage of the journey. Thank you very much for your time and your attention.